3 hours after my husband threw me out into the freezing night, the phone in his kitchen rang, and it wasn't me on the other end. It was a detective. She told him his wife was lying in a hospital bed, with a gash on her head, and that a gray SUV had been seen speeding away from where she fell. Elijah would walk into that hospital room expecting to find a liar. Instead, he'd find a truth he never let himself see coming. But before any of that, there was a locked door, a porch light going dark, and a man I'd loved for 18 choosing his son's word over mine. I was 50 years old, standing on my own front porch, in a thin wool sweater, watching my husband turn the deadbolt from the inside. The snow came in sideways under the porch, light stinging my cheeks, while Caleb stood behind him with the calm, satisfied posture of a man who just won a war I didn't know I was fighting. "Go, Ava," Elijah said through the storm door, not even opening it all the way. "I don't want to see you until the money's back." "You actually believe I stole from you?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I believe my son." 5 words. 18 years, and it came down to 5 words. It was the last night of January, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. I had on a sweater, slacks, and the flats I wore around the house, nothing more. My phone, my wallet, my coat, even my blood pressure medication were still inside, sitting exactly where I left them that morning. Caleb had gathered my things from around the house earlier that evening and locked them in our bedroom, telling his father I was getting ready to run. That a woman who wasn't planning to disappear wouldn't need her passport within reach. Elijah believed him. He gave me 10 minutes to leave and wouldn't let me back in for my phone certain. I'd use those minutes to erase evidence of something I hadn't done. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I told Elijah as calmly as I could manage, with my teeth starting to chatter, that the bank was already investigating irregularities on the account, that I was the one who'd reported them. Caleb cut in before I finished the sentence. "Don't let her stall, Dad. She's been doing this for weeks." I looked at my husband's face in the porch light and understood in that instant that he had already reached his verdict. He hadn't asked me a single fair question. He'd simply handed down a sentence and expected me to serve it. I stepped back off the porch before he could call the police and claim I was the one causing a disturbance. The door locked behind me with a sound I felt in my chest more than heard. Standing there in the cold, I thought about all the years that had led to this moment. I thought about the winter. I helped Elijah dig himself out of debt after his first divorce, back when he had nothing but a leased apartment and a 14-year-old son who barely spoke to him. I thought about sitting in an emergency room at 2:00 in the morning when Caleb broke his leg at 16, holding his hand while he cried, long before either of them called me family in any way that counted. I thought about the semester of college tuition I quietly covered so Caleb wouldn't have to drop out, and the jewelry, my mother's jewelry, that I sold without telling Elijah, so the dealership wouldn't go under during the recession. None of it mattered now. A folder of doctored paperwork and a few well-placed sentences from Caleb had erased 18 years in a single evening. I started walking toward the gas station roughly a mile down the road, the only place I knew would still be lit at that hour. The wind cut through my sweater like it wasn't there. My flats filled with snow within the first few hundred yards, and I could feel my feet losing sensation, that dull ache turning into something worse. I kept my arms wrapped around myself, and my head down, counting mailboxes to keep my mind from spiraling. Somewhere past the 3rd or 4th house, I heard an engine accelerate behind me. Headlights swept across the road, too bright, too fast for a quiet residential street at that hour. I turned instinctively, some old instinct from my fraud investigation days telling me to get a look at the vehicle. And that's when my foot caught a patch of black ice. I went down hard, my temple striking the curb. The last thing I saw before the world tilted and went dark at the edges was a gray SUV idling a short distance away, its tail lights glowing red against the falling snow. Something about the shape of it, the dent along the rear panel, was familiar in a way that made my stomach drop even as consciousness slipped from me. It looked exactly like Caleb's car. I don't know how long I lay there in the snow. The last thing I remember is a woman's voice, sharp with panic, shouting for someone to call 911. 3 hours later, the phone rang in my husband's kitchen, but the police weren't calling to ask if he wanted to come bring his wife home. They were calling because they needed him to come identify what was left of the story he thought he knew. To understand how I ended up alone on that road, you have to go back 6 weeks to the day Caleb showed up on our doorstep with 2 suitcases and a story about a tech company that had laid off half its staff. He said his girlfriend had left him. He said he just needed a few months to get back on his feet. I looked at Elijah's face when he asked if his son could stay with us, and I said yes, because I loved my husband, and because I remembered what it felt like to watch someone you love struggle without anyone catching them. I didn't know yet that I was the one who'd be caught. Within the first 2 weeks, I noticed things. Caleb took phone calls in the backyard, pacing, his voice dropping whenever I came near a window. He asked more than once in that offhand way people use when they're testing the water what the house might be worth if we ever sold it. I found him in Elijah's office more than once, thumbing through folders that had nothing to do with him. He suggested gently at first, then less gently, that his father should add his name to the deed, just in case anything happened. He told Elijah when he thought I wasn't listening that I'd gotten controlling over the years, that I liked keeping my husband dependent on me. I spent 11 years investigating insurance fraud before I became a risk consultant, and old instincts don't fade. I started noticing the kind of details that used to build a case file. A bank email showing a login from an unfamiliar device, a request to transfer $85,000 into an account tied to a shell company I'd never heard of. A photocopy of Elijah's signature sitting in the printer tray, practiced several times over like homework. Quint, an audio editing app, installed on Caleb's laptop that had no business being there. Payments flowing out to a sports betting site from an account registered under Elijah's dealership. I didn't confront him. Confrontation, in my experience, only teaches a liar to hide better. Instead, I quietly reported the irregularities to the bank's fraud division. I photographed the device history before it could be wiped. I called Detective Naomi Price, someone I'd worked alongside years earlier, and asked her off the record what I should be documenting. I brought copies of everything to Linda Chen, my attorney of almost 2 decades, and asked her to keep the investigation in quiet so Caleb wouldn't have a chance to destroy what I'd found. What I hadn't accounted for was how quickly he'd notice me watching. Caleb realized I was building something against him, and rather than run, he decided to get ahead of it. He built his own story, and he built it well. He created a fake email made to look like it came from me and sent it to a local real estate broker inquiring about a quick sale. He printed up a draft contract with my name typed at the bottom. He took a screenshot of the pending transfer request and cropped it so it looked like a completed transaction, rather than Clear's throat, a request still frozen in the bank's verification queue. He took my father-in-law's watch out of the box in my dresser drawer, a watch I'd sent out for repair 3 weeks earlier, with a receipt sitting in a drawer in my office to prove it, and left the empty case behind for Elijah to find. The worst of it was the recording. I'd had a phone call with Linda about setting up a clear medical power of attorney in case Elijah ever had another dizzy spell like the one that sent him to urgent care that spring. What I'd actually said was, if Elijah becomes unable to make decisions for himself because of a stroke, we need a clear medical power of attorney in place. Nita Caleb ran it through some kind of editing software and cut it down to 11 words. Elijah will no longer have the right to decide. We need power of attorney. Stripped of context, it sounded like a woman plotting to take control of her husband's life. Caleb took that lie to his father in pieces, never all at once. Always at moments when Elijah was tired or vulnerable. I don't want to break up your marriage, Dad. He'd say, soft and reluctant like a son forced into an unwanted role. But maybe she's been planning to leave for a while now. He knew exactly which wound to press. Elijah's first wife had drained a joint account and vanished with another man years before I ever entered the picture, and Elijah had never fully healed from missing the signs. Caleb used that old scar like a lever. You didn't see it coming last time, he told his father one night when I was upstairs and couldn't hear the exact words, only the tone. I just don't want it to happen again. The night it all came to a head, Caleb laid the folder out on our kitchen table, like a prosecutor presenting a closing argument. Elijah confronted me, but he wouldn't let me see the full contents, only the pieces Caleb wanted him to see. I tried to explain that I was the one who'd reported the bank activity in the first place. Caleb didn't miss a beat. Of course she'd say that. The person who gets caught always claims to be the one who found it. Elijah asked about the sale contract. I told him truthfully that the house couldn't be sold without my signature on it. Caleb turned my own words into a weapon. Hear that, Dad? She just said the house is hers. That was the moment Elijah learned for the first time in our marriage that his name had never been on the deed. His face changed. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to humiliation. The particular sting of learning something in front of your own child that you should have known for years. I tried to explain the timeline that I'd bought the house before we married, that it had nothing to do with trust or lack of it. He wasn't hearing me anymore. He was hearing 18 years rearranged into a story where he was the fool. What stays with me most thinking back on that kitchen table isn't Elijah's face. It's Caleb's in the half second before his father turned to look at him for confirmation. Not anger, fear. I understood it clearly only after I was already lying in the snow. Caleb hadn't simply wanted me out of the house that night. He needed me away from my phone and my computer before whatever he had planned could unfold without interference. The woman who found me was named Mary Ann Foster, a 62-year-old retired nurse driving home from her sister's house when her headlights caught something dark against the white shoulder of the road. She told me later that she almost mistook me for a fallen branch, that it was only the shape of an arm against the snow that made her slow down. She pulled over. She called 911 before she even got out of the car. She kept an emergency blanket in her trunk, the kind she'd carried for 30 years out of old nursing habit, and she wrapped it around me while she waited for the ambulance, talking to me the whole time, even though I couldn't answer her. She noticed a gray SUV pulling away from the area, its taillights disappearing around the corner without stopping, and some instinct told her to memorize part of the license plate. Before it vanished. She wrote it on her palm and pen because she didn't trust herself to remember it otherwise. At St. Catherine Medical Center, Dr. Samuel Reed diagnosed me with mild to moderate hypothermia, a mild concussion, a laceration at my temple that needed stitches, and an irregular heartbeat brought on by the cold and the stress on my system. He wanted me monitored for several hours before he'd consider releasing me. I remember surfacing slowly, the fluorescent lights too bright, the beeping of a monitor keeping time with my pulse, and the first coherent thought I had was to ask what time it was. The second was to ask someone to call Detective Naomi Price. Naomi arrived within the hour. She recognized me immediately. We'd worked the same insurance fraud case years earlier, back when I still carried a badge instead of a consulting fee. She didn't hug me or fuss over me. She pulled a chair beside the bed and asked me to tell her everything in order, starting with the moment Elijah locked the door. I told her. Elijah had thrown me out. Caleb had taken my phone. The vehicle at the scene might have been Caleb's. Caleb knew I'd been quietly working with the bank's fraud division, which meant he had a reason to want me isolated that night. Naomi didn't leap to conclusions. She told me plainly that it was entirely possible the SUV near the accident was a coincidence, that grief and fear have a way of making people see intention where there's only bad luck. But the fact that Caleb's vehicle had been in the vicinity, and that whoever was driving hadn't stopped for a woman lying unconscious in the snow, was something that needed to be looked at, regardless of intention. The evidence started coming in fast after that. Mary Ann provided the partial plate number from memory. Footage from the gas station down the road showed a gray SUV matching Caleb's passing by, within minutes of my leaving the house. Automated license plate readers confirmed the vehicle had circled back through the neighborhood before leaving again. The bank called to report that someone had just attempted to log into the flagged account and cancel the fraud investigation altogether. The login traced to a device registered to Caleb. With the risk that evidence could be deleted at any moment, officers moved quickly to secure an emergency warrant for his devices. Naomi called Elijah herself. I could only hear her side of it from the hospital bed, but it was short, deliberate. Mr. Morgan, this is Detective Naomi Price. Your wife is at St. Catherine Medical Center. I heard the tinny panic through the phone even from a few feet away. The hospital? What happened? She was found unconscious on the side of the road, suffering from hypothermia. You need to come now. He asked, apparently whether I was pressing charges against him. Naomi's response was flat. You should be worried about whether she makes it through the night safely. Caleb tried to keep him from leaving. I only learned the details afterward, but Elijah told me. Caleb argued that I was staging the whole thing, that I'd deliberately put myself in danger to make him feel guilty, that the police might be trying to bait him into incriminating himself, and he ought to call a lawyer before going anywhere. Elijah said something in Caleb's tone that night finally struck him as wrong. Too calculated, too rehearsed for a son worried about his father. How do you even know your stepmother was in an accident? Elijah asked him. Caleb hesitated, then claimed he'd overheard it during the phone call, but Naomi had never used the word accident. Elijah arrived at the hospital not long after. As he approached my room, he saw two officers standing outside. A representative from the bank's fraud department, and Linda Chen, my attorney, already seated near the nurse's station with a folder in her lap. On a small table near the doorway sat his father's watch, sealed inside a clear evidence bag. He walked in slowly. He looked at me, the white bandage at my temple, my skin still pale from the cold, the IV taped to the back of my hand, and something in his face cracked open. Then Naomi stepped forward and placed a printed still frame from the gas station camera on the table in front of him. Elijah looked down at the image, at the driver behind the wheel of the gray SUV. His face went the color of the snow outside the window. No, he said so quietly I almost didn't hear it. This can't be happening. Elijah stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like a full minute, before he made himself walk toward the bed. I watched him take inventory of me, the way you'd survey damage after a storm. The bandage at my temple, the pallor in my skin, the IV line taped to the back of my hand, the plastic hospital bag on the chair holding my soaked, ruined sweater. He noticed my feet last, the faint frost nip along my toes, and something in his expression buckled when he understood what that meant. He had sent me out into a blizzard without a coat, without shoes fit for weather, without so much as my phone to call for help. Until Ava, he said. I didn't know. You knew it was snowing, I said. I kept my voice even. There was no use raising it. Some truths land harder when they're spoken quietly. Naomi stepped closer and held up the printed still frame again, walking Elijah through what it actually showed Caleb's SUV near the spot where I'd fallen, time-stamped only minutes after I'd left the house. She was careful, professional, unwilling to overstate what the photo could and couldn't prove. It didn't show intent. It didn't prove he'd meant to run me off the road. But it proved he'd been there. It proved he'd seen me. It proved he hadn't stopped, hadn't called for help, and had gone home afterward and told his father he'd never left the living room. Elijah shook his head almost reflexively. Caleb was home with me. Naomi laid out the plate reader data beside the photograph, the timestamps lining up like a ledger that left no room for argument. I watched my husband's certainty crack in real time, watched him arrive slowly and against everything he wanted to believe at the same conclusion he'd spoken in the doorway. No, he said again. This can't be happening. Then Linda took her turn. She explained in the calm, unhurried tone she used with juries that I'd sent Elijah's father's watch out for repair 3 weeks prior. She had the receipt. The jewelry shop had security footage of the drop-off, time-stamped and dated with my signature on the intake form. Caleb, she explained, had gone to the shop afterward and picked it up under false pretenses, claiming to be retrieving it on his father's behalf. He'd left the empty box in my drawer for someone to find at exactly the right moment. Officers had since located the watch itself, hidden in a compartment beneath the driver's seat of Caleb's car. I watched something shift behind Elijah's eyes. The folder Caleb built wasn't evidence. It was a stage set. The bank's fraud representative spoke next, laying out the transaction Caleb had used as his centerpiece. I hadn't withdrawn $85,000. I'd reported the suspicious request myself, days before Elijah ever saw a printed screenshot. The transfer had originated from Elijah's old tablet, a device he rarely used anymore. The verification code meant to confirm the transaction had been rerouted to a prepaid phone number linked to Caleb. The receiving account belonged to an LLC Caleb had registered using an old friend's name to keep his own off the paperwork. Elijah couldn't look at me directly anymore. He kept his eyes on the folder Linda had brought, as if staring hard enough might rearrange the facts back into the shape he'd believed that morning. He tried weakly to explain that Caleb's evidence had seemed convincing at the time. He said he'd only meant for me to be gone one night. He said he'd planned to come find me himself in the morning. I asked him the only question that mattered. "You turned off the porch light while I was still standing on it. Where exactly did you think I was supposed to go?" He didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't expected one. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters more than the drama of the reveal itself. I didn't forgive him in that hospital room. I didn't feel a wave of relief wash the anger away, just because the truth had finally surfaced. Caleb built the lie, yes, but it was Elijah's hand on the deadbolt. It was Elijah who chose not to ask me a single question before passing judgment. I said as much to him plainly without raising my voice. "The Caleb built the lie, but you're the one who opened the door and pushed me out into it." He had no response to that either. Some silences say more than any apology could. Naomi's phone rang before the moment could stretch any further. She stepped a few feet away to take the call, her expression sharpening as she listened. When she came back, she told us the search team had gone through Caleb's room at the house. What they found went beyond anything any of us had expected. A copy of the deed to our house, my name circled in pen like a problem to be solved. Sheets of paper covered in Elijah's signature, over and over, until it was nearly convincing. Draft contract transferring ownership of the house into Caleb's name. An unsent email to a lending company, still sitting in the drafts folder. And beneath all of it, a life insurance policy newly issued $750,000 written on Elijah's life. The sole beneficiary was Caleb. Elijah's signature was on that policy too. It was forged just like everything else. Naomi laid it out for us the way she must have laid out 100 cases before mine. Careful not to speculate beyond what the evidence actually supported, Caleb hadn't set out simply to steal $85,000. That figure was only the opening move. The plan, once you saw all its pieces lined up together, had 4 stages. First, convince Elijah that I was the one betraying him. Second, get me out of the house and cut off my access to my phone and computer before I could interfere. Third, persuade Elijah to sign over financial power of attorney, framed as a way to protect himself from a wife who could no longer be trusted. Fourth, use that authority to borrow heavily against the house and the dealership. What Caleb hadn't accounted for was the ground he thought he was standing on. The house was never Elijah's to mortgage. I'd bought it in 2002, years before Elijah and I ever met, and my name alone remained on the deed. The equity Elijah had contributed. Over the years existed under a separate financial agreement Linda had drawn up early in our marriage, protecting both of us. The dealership carried debt I'd conditionally guaranteed, and Linda already had documents prepared to revoke that guarantee the moment fraud was confirmed. Caleb had built an elaborate scheme on top of a foundation that had never belonged to him. Naomi played the full unedited recording of my call with Linda, the one Caleb had cut down to 11 damning words. In the original, I was talking about setting up a clear medical power of attorney after Elijah's dizzy spell that spring. "I want Elijah to keep making his own decisions for as long as possible," my recorded voice said. "The power of attorney should only take effect if he loses the capacity to think clearly for himself." Caleb had sliced off the first half entirely, leaving only a sentence that sounded like a woman scheming to strip her husband of his rights. Hearing the full version played back in my own voice, in that sterile hospital room, was its own kind of vindication. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. The financial picture that emerged from the search was staggering. Caleb owed more than $140,000, spread across 3 private lenders who didn't extend the kind of patience banks did. He'd used dealership paperwork as collateral without Elijah's knowledge. One lender had given him a week to produce $60,000 or face consequences he clearly didn't want to describe to police. He believed with the kind of desperate logic debt produces that mortgaging our house would solve everything. Dour. There was resentment, tangled up in the desperation too. 3 months earlier, I'd refused to hand him cash to cover a gambling debt. I'd told him calmly that I'd pay for treatment for a real program, but I wouldn't fund the habit itself. I'll pay for you to get help, I'd said. I won't pay for you to keep betting. He'd told his father afterward that I hated him, that I wanted him gone from the family entirely. It wasn't true, but it was useful. And Caleb had never been shy about using whatever was useful. Sitting in that hospital bed, I found myself walking Elijah back through years of warning signs he'd chosen to explain away. Caleb taking his father's credit card without asking, lying about finishing his degree, borrowing money from his aunt, and then denying it to her face. A car accident while driving under the influence that Elijah quietly paid to settle rather than let his son face any real consequence. You didn't protect Caleb, I told him. You taught him that every consequence could be paid off by his father. I watched that land harder than anything else I'd said all night. Harder than the forged signatures. Harder than the insurance policy. A man can absorb evidence of a crime more easily than he can absorb the idea that he built the person capable of committing it. Linda brought out the deed to settle the last piece of confusion. I'd purchased the house in 2002. Elijah moved in 2007. We married in 2008. His name was never added, not out of secrecy, but because he was still working through financial obligations from his first divorce when we married, and timing never seemed to matter enough to revisit. I'd once suggested drawing up a lifetime right of residency for him, ensuring he'd never lose his home, no matter what happened between us. The paperwork sat unsigned for years because he kept putting it off. I hadn't used the house as leverage or as a weapon. I'd used it quietly as the one piece of ground beneath me that no one could take. I made a few decisions that night, and I said them plainly, without softening them for anyone's comfort. Elijah wouldn't return home while the investigation was active. He could retrieve personal items only with an officer present. Caleb was barred from any access to the property. I would begin the process of revoking my guarantee on the dealership's fraud-tainted debts. And the marriage itself, that decision would not be made tonight, under fluorescent lights, with stitches still fresh in my scalp. Elijah asked me quietly not to end things. You ended my sense of safety the moment you locked that door, I told him. Everything after that is mine to decide in my own time. Naomi stepped back into the room before he could respond, her expression tighter than I'd seen it all night. Caleb, she said, had gone back to the house. Doorbell camera footage showed him in the garage, pouring gasoline, attempting to burn a box of documents in a metal bin. Officers were already on their way. Elijah's face drained of whatever color the hospital lights had left in it. His son wasn't simply trying to erase evidence anymore. He was prepared to burn down the house itself. In the same breath, he'd once claimed he was only trying to protect. Officers reached the house before the fire in the garage could spread past the metal bin Caleb had been using. What they found there closed the last gaps in the case. Gasoline, torn copies of bank statements, a laptop with its screen smashed in, as though he'd tried to destroy it with his bare hands, a prepaid phone, the forged contract transferring ownership of the house, threatening text messages from at least one of his lenders. The kind that made it clear his week to produce $60,000 had already run out. Caleb was arrested that night. The charges that followed were serious, though careful: identity fraud, forgery, unauthorized access to financial accounts, evidence tampering, and destruction of property by fire. Naomi was honest with us about the accident on the road. The footage showed Caleb slowing near where I'd fallen, and driving on, which supported a charge of leaving the scene, but there wasn't enough to prove he'd deliberately tried to hurt me. I appreciated that honesty more than I can say. It would have been easy for the story to tip into something cleaner, and more satisfying Caleb as an outright attempted killer. But that wasn't what the evidence showed, and I didn't want a version of the truth stretched past what actually happened. I was released from the hospital 2 days later, still weak, still moving carefully around the stitches at my temple. Elijah and I both attended Caleb's initial hearings, sitting several rows apart in a courtroom that smelled like old wood polish and nerves. Caleb looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the composure he always wore like a second skin. He spoke to his father first, his voice pitched low, urgent. "I did all of this to protect you from her." Elijah's answer came out flat, by letting her freeze to death in the snow. Caleb denied it immediately, insisting he'd only followed me to make sure I left the neighborhood, nothing more. Naomi had already shown us the footage of his car slowing as it passed me on the road, and then continuing on without stopping. He didn't have an answer for that timestamp, and for a moment his composure slipped enough that I saw briefly the frightened man underneath the performance. He turned to me next, some of the old coldness returning to his face. "That house was supposed to belong to this family. I was your family for 18 years, I told him. You only remembered that word when you wanted something from it." Elijah faced his own reckoning in that courtroom hallway afterward. Caleb, given one last chance before being led away, begged his father to cover his bail the way he'd covered every consequence before. It was in its own way the final test of everything I'd said to Elijah in that hospital room. For the first time in 18 years, he said no. "You need to face what you did," he told his son. Caleb's composure cracked entirely then, and he turned the blame outward, accusing me of taking his father from him. Elijah's response surprised me more than anything else that day. "No," he said. "You're the one who showed me the man I'd let myself become. It wasn't forgiveness, not for me, not yet. But it was the first real sign of a man beginning to take responsibility for the shape of his own choices, rather than handing the bill to someone else the way he always had." Linda spent the following weeks untangling the financial wreckage. Caleb had no legal claim to the house. That much had never been in question, but it was formally permanently confirmed. His name was removed as a beneficiary from every account and trust connected to Elijah. I bore no responsibility for the debts he'd accumulated using the dealership's name. The business itself would need restructuring, but Linda had shielded most of it from the forged paperwork before real damage was done. My own assets, the house included, remained entirely separate and untouched. The larger question, what happened to my marriage, took longer to answer. Elijah asked to come home to start over, to try to rebuild what 18 years had apparently not been enough to protect. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, a few days later, I handed him an envelope. Inside was a legal separation agreement, a temporary arrangement for dividing our belongings, a list of what he could take from the house, and tucked behind the legal paperwork information for a 6-month lease on a small apartment across town, the first month already paid. So he wouldn't find himself without a roof over his head in the middle of winter, regardless of what he'd done to me. He looked at the folder for a long moment before he spoke. "After everything I did, you're still helping me. I don't want you dying out in the cold," I told him. "That's the difference between us." I meant it as a simple fact, not a performance of virtue. Some people confuse mercy with weakness. I've never believed the two were the same thing. He looked down at the separation papers again, and I watched him search for something to say that might change the outcome. "Is there any chance for us?" he finally asked. "Not for the marriage we used to have," I told him. I didn't say more than that. I hadn't decided yet whether anything else might exist on the other side of what we'd both survived, and I wasn't going to manufacture false hope just to soften the moment for him. Some doors close permanently. Others simply need time before you know which kind you're standing in front of. 6 months passed before the last pieces of that winter finally settled into place. Caleb accepted a plea deal with the prosecutor rather than risk trial. He was sentenced to a fixed prison term, along with financial probation and a restitution order that would follow him for years. As part of his sentencing, he entered a mandatory gambling addiction treatment program inside the facility. The incident on the road never became a criminal charge in itself. There wasn't enough evidence to prove intent to harm, but his decision to leave me, unconscious in the snow rather than stop, was formally noted in the sentencing record. A permanent mark on the story of who he'd chosen to be that night. Elijah sold his stake in the dealership to satisfy the legitimate debts Caleb's scheme had left behind, and he began living more simply than he had in years. He started attending a support group for parents of adult children struggling with addiction, something I hadn't expected from him, but was quietly glad to hear about. Me. Our divorce was finalized in early summer. I made my own decision about the house not long after. I didn't hand it over to charity in some grand gesture the way stories like this sometimes end. I'm not interested in performing generosity I don't fully feel. Instead, I sold it. I couldn't picture myself continuing to live in the place where my own husband had locked me outside in a blizzard, no matter how many good years had happened there. Before that night, with part of the proceeds, I bought a smaller house near Lake Erie, close enough to hear the water some mornings when the wind was right. With another part, I started a legal aid fund for women over 45 facing financial abuse within their marriages. Women who often discover the way I did, that the people who are supposed to protect them can just as easily become the ones who need protecting from. I named the fund after my mother, not after myself. She was the one who taught me long before any of this happened that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be true. Elijah came to see me at the new house once near the end of that summer to return an old set of keys that no longer opened anything of mine. He stood on the porch for a moment before I invited him in, and I noticed he didn't try to push past that invisible line the way he once might have. I thought locking you out that night was protecting our family, he said. Family doesn't need to be protected from the truth, I told him. He apologized for more believing Caleb. He apologized for not asking me a single question before making up his mind, for not trusting 18 years of history over a folder full of lies, for choosing his own comfort that night instead of my safety, for using a snowstorm as a punishment. I accepted the apology. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. Accepting an apology isn't the same as inviting someone back into your life. I told him as much. Forgiveness doesn't come with a key, I said. He nodded like he understood, and then he left. I watched him walk back to his car from the window, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel after everything. Not triumph, not even relief exactly. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes after a long time of not having any. That evening snow began to fall again, light and unhurried, settling over the new walkway the way it had settled over the old one 6 months earlier. But this time was different, and I noticed every part of the difference. I had a warm coat on. My phone was in my pocket, fully charged, mine, to use however I chose. My keys were in my hand, not locked away in someone else's decision. I was the one who would decide tonight, and every night after, whether that door stayed open or closed. Marianne, the woman who found me in the snow that night, and never once asked for anything in return, came by for dinner with a few of my friends. I opened the door and let them in out of the cold, the sound of their laughter filling a house that had never once belonged to anyone but me. 6 months ago, a door closed behind me on the coldest night of the winter. I remember thinking in that moment that the sound of that lock turning was the sound of my life falling apart. I was wrong. It was the sound of a prison opening. Elijah believed his son's lies and put me out of my own home. It took the police, a hospital bed, and a stack of forged documents to show him the truth. But the truth that mattered most to me was never written on any of that paperwork. I don't need a man who only believes me once the evidence has been laid out in front of him. I need someone who believed in who I was long before any evidence became necessary. Outside, the snow kept falling over the new path to my door. I rested my hand against the frame, listened to my friends laughing behind me, and locked it not to keep anyone out, but to protect the peace that finally lived inside. This time the key stayed in my hand. I'd love to know what you think Ava's next chapter looks like. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so hit subscribe and don't miss a single moment. Let's keep this journey going together. 2 hours after I drove away from that barbecue, my husband and his daughter pulled into the driveway of his mother's house and found a lawyer's car waiting at the curb, a yellow envelope taped to the front door, and their entire understanding of who really owned that house about to collapse in front of the whole family. But to understand how we got there, you need to go back to that afternoon. Back to the moment a spilled glass of lemonade turned into the last mistake my husband ever let his daughter make in front of me. My name is Ashley Collins. I'm 45. I spent 18 years teaching third grade before I stepped back to help run my husband's small contracting business. And until that Saturday in June, I would have told you I had a good marriage. Not a perfect one, a good one. The kind you build slowly with patience. The kind where you learn to live around old wounds that aren't yours to heal. Ryan and I had been married 9 years. He came with a daughter from his first marriage, Madison, 22, now in her last year of college, and I came in knowing exactly what that meant. I never tried to be her mother. I never used that word, never asked for that title. I told myself early on that respect doesn't require love, and love isn't something you can force a grown child to feel for you. I just wanted peace. I wanted us to function like a family, even a complicated one. That Saturday, his mother, Helen, was hosting the annual summer barbecue at her house, the same gathering she'd thrown every June for as long as I'd known the family. I got there at 9 in the morning. I unloaded 4 bags of groceries myself, strung the lights along the porch rail, set up the folding tables, and stood over the grill in the heat for 2 hours because Ryan said his back was bothering him. That was fine. I didn't mind. I liked making Helen's yard look good. She'd always been kind to me in her quiet way, even when the rest of the family treated me like a placeholder. Madison arrived late, the way she always did. Sunglasses pushed up into her hairphone in her hand. Barely a glance in my direction as she walked past the grill toward her cousins. I was carrying a tray of corn to the table when I turned, just turned the ordinary way anyone turns in a crowded yard, and my shoulder grazed hers. Her lemonade tipped a few drops, landing on her white sneaker. That was it. That was the whole event. She spun around like I'd shoved her. Don't ever touch me again. Her voice cracked across the yard loud enough that conversation stopped. Aunts turned. Cousins turned. Someone's fork paused halfway to their mouth. I actually laughed at first, thinking she had to be joking because it was lemonade. Because it was an accident, because I had just spent 2 hours cooking her favorite ribs. Madison, it was an accident. You did that on purpose. She snapped. You always do this. You always find a way to touch me or get near me like you're trying to prove something. I felt my face go hot. Not from embarrassment, from disbelief. I looked around for Ryan, expecting him to step in to say something, anything to remind his daughter that I'd been standing over a hot grill on her behalf since 9:09 in the morning. Adi. Instead, I watched him walk toward us with that particular look he got whenever Madison raised her voice. The look of a man bracing to manage her feelings before anyone else's. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look at the lemonade on her shoe, or the tray still balanced in my hands. He looked at me, and his voice came out flat final, like he was reading from a script he'd already written in his head years ago. Apologize to my daughter or leave. I want you to understand something about me. I am not a dramatic person. I don't raise my voice. I don't storm out of rooms. I spent 2 decades managing a classroom of 8-year-olds by staying calm when everyone around me wasn't. But something in me went very quiet and very still in that moment. The way water goes still right before it turns to ice. I looked at my husband. I waited for him to soften to say, "Come on, both of you, let's just cool down." I waited for anyone in that yard, his sister, his brother-in-law, even one of the cousins who'd eaten off my grill 20 minutes earlier to say a single word in my defense. No one did. "No," I said. Just that. I set the tray of corn down on the table, wiped my hands on my apron, untied it, and folded it over the back of a chair. Helen was standing near the porch steps, and for 1 second our eyes met. She didn't say anything either, but there was something in her face I didn't have time to read yet, something that wasn't surprise. I picked up my purse from the porch swing, walked to my car without looking back, and drove home in a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I didn't cry. I remember that clearly because I expected to, and I didn't. I just drove, replaying 9 years in my head, wondering how many other moments like this one I had quietly swallowed without naming them for what they were. I had no idea pulling into our driveway alone that somewhere across town, a phone was already ringing a law office, trying to reach me about a house. A decision made 3 years earlier, and a piece of paper that was about to change everything. The house was quiet when I got home. The kind of quiet that used to feel peaceful, and now just felt hollow. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment before I even set my purse down, staring at the counter where I'd left a note that morning, reminding Ryan to bring extra ice. 9 years, I thought. 9 years of notes like that. Small, thoughtless acts of care nobody ever seemed to notice until they were missing. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink and sat at the table, and for the first time in a long while, I let myself actually think back over those years instead of brushing past them the way I usually did. When I married Ryan, Madison was 13, caught in that raw, unsteady age between childhood and something else, still grieving the divorce, even though it was 2 years behind her by then. I never once tried to replace her mother. I made that promise to myself before I ever moved a single box into that house. I would be steady, I would be present, and I would never demand a title I hadn't earned. I thought foolishly maybe that if I gave her enough time and enough space, she'd eventually let me exist in her life as something other than an intruder. I paid for her first semester of college out of my own savings when Ryan's business hit a rough patch, and he was too proud to ask his mother for help. I sat in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours after her car accident sophomore year, because Ryan was stuck out of state on a job and couldn't get a flight back until the next morning. I drove her to 3 follow-up appointments that spring, sat through 2 physical therapy sessions just so she wouldn't be alone in the waiting room, and threw her a 21st birthday party the following year that I planned down to the last string light because she'd mentioned once offhand that she'd always wanted one like that. She never said thank you, not once, not for any of it. I used to tell myself that was fine, that gratitude wasn't the point, that I wasn't doing it to be thanked. But there's a difference between not needing thanks and being treated like you don't exist. And somewhere over the years, that line had gotten blurry in my own head. Whenever I mentioned any of this to Ryan carefully, gently, never as a complaint, he had the same answer every time. Give her time, Ash. She's been through a lot. And I did give her time. I gave her 9 years of it. But the years didn't soften her toward me. If anything, they hardened something in her, like she'd decided early on that treating me as temporary was safer than risking anything else. I remembered the Christmas 2 years ago, when she called me Dad's mistake to her cousin in the kitchen, not realizing I was standing right behind the pantry door. I remembered how Ryan, when I told him that night, said only that she probably didn't mean it that way, that she was going through a hard semester. There was always a reason. There was always a hard semester, a stressful breakup, a bad week. I stopped counting the excuses somewhere around year 6. Today wasn't really about a splash of lemonade. I understood that clearly now, sitting alone in my kitchen with my tea going cold. Today was the moment 9 years of small erasers finally added up to something I couldn't swallow anymore. My husband had looked me in the eye, in front of his entire family, and chosen his daughter's tantrum over the woman who'd spent the morning cooking for all of them. And the worst part wasn't even the choosing. It was how easy it had looked on his face. Like it wasn't a choice at all. I was still sitting there when I finally checked my phone, which I'd left in my purse since the moment I'd stormed off. 3 missed calls, all from the same number, all within the last 40 minutes. I didn't recognize it at first. But the voicemail left no room for confusion. Mrs. Collins, this is David Harper from Harper Legal Group. It's important that we speak as soon as possible. Please call my office back today if you're able. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, genuinely confused. I didn't know any lawyers named Harper. I hadn't been in any accidents, hadn't been sued, hadn't signed anything I could recall that would warrant this kind of urgency in a stranger's voice. My first thought, absurdly, was that something had happened to Helen, that she'd fallen or worse, and someone was trying to reach me, Because Ryan's phone had been in his pocket during the argument, and mine hadn't. My hands weren't quite steady as I dialed the number back. It rang twice before a receptionist picked up, and when I gave my name, her voice shifted immediately. Gentler, more careful the way people sound when they know something you don't. Mrs. Collins, thank you for calling back. Mr. Harper would like to see you in person if you're able to come in today. It concerns a matter involving Helen Brooks. My chest tightened. Is she all right? She's fine, the receptionist said quickly. This isn't about her health. It's about a legal matter she asked us to handle. Mr. Harper felt it was best explained face to face. I looked at the clock. It was barely 4:50 in the afternoon. I thought about Ryan and Madison, probably still at the barbecue. Probably telling everyone their version of what happened. Probably not missing me at all yet. I grabbed my keys off the counter, my tea still untouched and going cold behind me, and drove across town, not knowing that within the hour I would be sitting across a desk, being told something about my own life that I never could have imagined. Harper Legal Group occupied the second floor of a quiet brick building downtown, the kind of place with heavy wooden doors, and a receptionist who offered me water before I'd even sat down. I remember noticing how cold my hands were despite the warm afternoon. How my mind kept circling back to the barbecue, to Ryan's face, to the silence of that yard, even as I tried to focus on why I was here instead. David Harper turned out to be an older man, maybe late 50s, with the calm, unhurried manner of someone who'd delivered difficult news to a lot of people over the years, and had learned not to rush it. He shook my hand, offered me a seat across from his desk, and folded his hands together before he spoke. Mrs. Collins, thank you for coming in on short notice. I know this is unusual, and I'll try to make this as clear as I can. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents I didn't recognize, a property deed, a trust agreement, several pages of dense legal language with tabs marking specific sections. My eyes skimmed the top of the deed and caught on a name I wasn't expecting to see. Mine. 3 years ago, Harper said, Helen Brooks transferred ownership of her house, the house where the family gathering was held today, into a trust with you, named as the sole beneficiary. The property was legally retitled in your name at that time. Ryan and Madison have continued residing there under an informal arrangement Helen set up, but the ownership itself has belonged to you since that transfer was finalized. I sat very still. I actually asked him to repeat it because it didn't fit anywhere in what I understood about my own life. That house, I said slowly. Helen's house. The one we were just at this morning. That house, he confirmed. Why would she do that? And why wouldn't she tell me? Harper explained that Helen had come to him 3 years earlier, not long after a health scare that had frightened her more than she'd let on to the rest of the family, though she'd wanted the house protected, secured for someone she trusted completely. And she'd told him. Harper read this part almost verbatim, like he wanted to get her words exactly right, that I was the only one who had shown up for her without being asked, without expecting anything back, she said. He continued, glancing at his notes, that you were the only one who ever treated her like a person and not an obligation. I thought of every Sunday I'd spent driving Helen to her cardiology appointments, while Ryan claimed he was too busy with work. I thought of the winter I'd found a contractor and paid out of pocket to fix her leaking roof before Ryan even knew the gutters had failed. None of that had felt like it was building toward anything. I'd done it because I loved her plainly, and simply the way you love people who never make you feel like a burden. Harper turned to another page. There's a condition attached to the arrangement. Helen structured it so that Ryan and Madison could continue living in the house comfortably, so long as certain terms were respected. Specifically, he tapped the clause. If either of them, at any point, was found to have insulted, threatened, or humiliated you, you would have the legal right to terminate their residency immediately. The room went very quiet. I thought about Madison's voice cracking across that yard. Don't ever touch me again. I thought about Ryan's face, cold and unmoved. Apologize to my daughter or leave. I hadn't known standing in that yard an hour ago that I was standing on ground I already legally owned. Do you want to enforce it? Harper asked, not unkindly. It wasn't a question meant to push me one direction or the other. It was simply the question the moment required. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my forearm, where a faint red mark was still visible from where Madison had shoved past me earlier trying to get to her car. Something I hadn't even registered as a bruise until just now sitting in this office under fluorescent light. I thought about 9 years of being tolerated instead of welcomed. I thought about every excuse I'd accepted, every give her time I'd swallowed without comment, every moment I'd made myself smaller so the peace in that family could stay intact. I wasn't angry in the way people picture anger. No shaking, no raised voice. What I felt was closer to clarity. A door quietly closing somewhere inside me, one I hadn't even realized had been propped open for years. Yes, I said, I want to enforce it. Harper nodded slowly like he'd expected that answer, but wanted to hear me arrive at it myself. He explained the next steps, the paperwork already prepared in advance at Helen's request, the locksmith on standby, the formal notice that would need to be delivered in person. He asked if I wanted to be there when it happened. I thought about it for a moment and then shook my head. No, I don't need to see their faces. I just need it done properly and legally and quietly. As I stood to leave, Harper mentioned one more detail almost in passing, that Helen had specifically asked to be present at the house when the notice was delivered, that she'd said this was something she needed to say to her son herself, after years of staying silent. I didn't fully understand what that meant yet. I only knew, walking out of that office into the fading afternoon light, that I was no longer the same woman who had driven away from that barbecue 2 hours earlier. While I was sitting in that office learning the truth about a house I never knew I owned, Ryan and Madison were still finishing out the barbecue back at Helen's, is apparently in good spirits, apparently untroubled by what had happened. I only pieced this part together later from things Helen told me afterward. But it's worth telling because it shows exactly where their heads were in the hours before everything changed. According to Helen, Ryan spent the rest of the afternoon acting like nothing had happened at all. He grilled the remaining burgers, laughed with his brother-in-law about some football game, and when someone asked where I'd gone, he waved it off with something like, "She needed to cool down. She'll be fine." Madison, for her part, sat by the pool with her cousin, scrolling her phone, occasionally mentioning the scene I'd supposedly caused, framing it like I was the one who'd overreacted to an innocent accident. On the drive home that evening, Helen said Madison actually laughed about it. She'll come crawling back tomorrow with an apology. She reportedly told her father, acting like nothing happened, same as always. Ryan agreed. He told her half-joking that this was just how I processed things, that I'd sulk for a day, and then smooth it all over the way I apparently always did. It wasn't cruelty exactly in his mind. It was just how he'd learned to categorize me over the years. The reasonable one, the one who always came around, the one who never made things difficult for long. They pulled into the driveway a little after 7, expecting an ordinary evening. Instead, they found a car they didn't recognize parked at the curb, a man in a suit standing near the front steps with a folder in hand, and a locksmith's van idling farther down the street, for Ryan, Helen told me, actually thought for a second he'd pulled up to the wrong house. David Harper introduced himself calmly, the same unhurried manner he'd used with me an hour earlier. He explained that he represented Helen Brooks, and that he had documents to deliver regarding the property. Ryan, confused, asked if something had happened to his mother's estate, planning some routine update he hadn't been told about. Harper simply handed him the envelope. Ryan tore it open right there on the porch. Helen said she watched his face as he read the first line, watched the color drain out of it in real time. The deed was direct, unambiguous, official, Ashley Collins, legal owner, effective 3 years prior. "That's ridiculous," Madison said, grabbing the paper out of her father's hands, scanning it herself like she expected to find some kind of mistake, some clerical error that would make this whole thing dissolve. "This has to be fake. Grandma would never do this without telling us." Harper, unbothered by her tone, opened his folder and laid out the supporting documents one by one on the porch railing. The notarized deed, the trust paperwork, the attorney certification, everything filed. Everything legitimate. Everything dated years before that afternoon's argument had ever happened. There was no error to find. Ryan turned to his mother, who was standing a few feet away, quiet in a way Helen was almost never quiet. "Mom, is this real?" Helen didn't answer right away. She told me later that she'd rehearsed this moment in her head more times than she could count over the past 3 years, imagining how she'd explain it, softening the words in her mind so they wouldn't land too hard. But standing there on the porch, watching her son's face, she found she didn't want to soften anything anymore. "It's real," she said simply. Madison's voice climbed sharp and disbelieving. "You gave our house to her to Ashley. Why would you do that?" Helen's answer, according to what she told me afterward, was quiet but unwavering because she's the only one who ever earned it. Ryan wasn't ready to accept any of it. He told Harper this had to be some kind of mistake, that he'd fought for years to protect his family's stability, that no court would uphold a transfer like this without his knowledge. Harper, patient as ever, reminded him that the transfer had never required his knowledge or consent in the first place. It was Helen's property, Helen's decision, and Helen's right to give it to whomever she chose. "There's also a condition attached," Harper added, turning to a marked page. Clause 8. "If either of you is found to have insulted, threatened, or humiliated Mrs. Collins, the residency arrangement terminates immediately." Ryan's face changed again, this time with something closer to dread than confusion. He looked at Madison. Madison looked away. "No one can prove anything happened today," Ryan said, his voice lower now, more careful, like a man, realizing too late that the ground beneath him had shifted hours before he'd even noticed. "It was just an accident, a misunderstanding." Harper opened a second folder thinner than the first and set it beside the deed on the railing. "We'll get to that," he said. "Mrs. Brooks has something she'd like to say first." Ryan tried to push past Harper toward the front door, insisting this whole thing needed to be sorted out inside, away from the street, away from whatever neighbors might be watching from their porches. Harper didn't move. He simply held up a hand calm as ever, and reminded Ryan that until the matter of Clause 8 was resolved, the house wasn't his to invite anyone into. "You can't be serious," Ryan said. "You're going to stand on my mother's porch and tell me I can't walk into my own home." "It's not your home," Harper said, not unkindly, just factually, not legally, not for the past 3 years. Madison had gone quiet in a way that unsettled Helen, more than her earlier outburst had. She stood near the porch railing with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the deed still lying open in her father's hands, like she was waiting for the words on it to rearrange themselves into something less permanent to happen. Harper opened the second folder. Clause 8 requires documentation before it can be enforced. Mrs. Brooks anticipated this might happen eventually given the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed over the years. So, she asked me to compile what evidence existed. I want to be clear this wasn't gathered today. It's been accumulating for some time. He laid out the contents one piece at a time. A short video clip taken by one of the younger cousins on a phone months earlier at a family dinner showing Madison calling me Dad's replacement. Loud enough for the whole table to hear, and Ryan laughing it off instead of correcting her. 3 written statements from relatives who'd witnessed similar incidents over the years and had quietly told Helen about them, never realizing those conversations would matter someday. 2 text messages Madison had sent to a cousin, screenshots forwarded to Helen, at some point referring to me in language ugly enough that Ryan actually flinched reading it over Harper's shoulder, and Helen's own written statement dated that very afternoon describing exactly what she'd witnessed at the barbecue a few hours earlier. The shoulder bump, Madison's scream, Ryan's ultimatum, my quiet exit. "None of that proves anything," Ryan said, but his voice had lost its certainty. He was scanning the pages now instead of arguing with them. Helen stepped forward. "In 9 years, I don't think I'd ever heard her raise her voice at her son. Not once. Not even when I'd overheard secondhand about disagreements between them. She'd always been the family's quiet peacekeeper, absorbing tension so it wouldn't spread, smoothing things over, rather than naming them. Standing on that porch in front of Harper, in front of Madison, she stopped doing that. "I saw everything," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried I saw Madison scream at Ashley over an accident. I saw you tell your wife to apologize or leave without asking a single question first. I have watched this happen in smaller ways for years, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in your marriage. I was wrong. It was exactly my place. I watched a woman who has done nothing but show up for this family get treated like she didn't belong in it. Ryan stood frozen, the papers hanging loosely in his hand. Mom, I'm not finished, Helen said. You have a daughter who needed boundaries a long time ago. And instead of giving her boundaries, you gave her permission every single time. And I let you, because I didn't want to cause more conflict in a family that already had enough of it. That was my mistake, and I'm not making it again today. Madison's composure finally cracked. She'd been standing rigid through her grandmother's entire statement, but now her shoulders started shaking, and when she spoke, her voice came out small, in a way I imagine none of them had heard from her in years. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was just an accident. I reacted. You've been reacting like that for 9 years. Helen said gentler now, but not backing down. This is just the first time it cost you something. Harper, giving the family a moment before continuing, finally spoke again. Given the documentation, and given Mrs. Brooks's testimony as a direct witness to today's incident, the conditions of Clause 8 have been satisfied. Dee, effective immediately, the residency arrangement is terminated. Mrs. Collins has authorized a 30-day window for you to arrange alternate housing and remove your belongings. Ryan looked at his mother, then at the locksmith still waiting patiently by his van, then at the deed in his own hands, as if some part of him was still hoping the paper might change if he looked at it long enough. It didn't. I need to talk to Ashley, he said quietly. That's your choice to make, Harper replied. But I'd encourage you to think carefully about what you want to say, and why before you make that call. Ryan didn't respond to that. He just stood there on the porch of the house he'd lived in for years, holding proof that it had never really been his in the first place, while his daughter cried quietly beside him, and his mother watched with an expression that held no satisfaction in being right, only years of tired, overdue relief. Ryan called me 11 times that night. I know because I finally looked at my phone around 9:00, sitting alone in the guest room of my sister's house, 2 towns over, where I'd driven straight from Harper's office without going home first. I hadn't decided yet whether I wanted to see Ryan's face when the truth landed on him. But some instinct told me not to be standing in that driveway when it did. I didn't answer any of the calls, not out of spite. I genuinely didn't know what I would say yet, and I'd learned enough in my years of teaching to know that the most important conversation shouldn't happen in anger on either side. Madison texted twice. The first message just said, "Please call my dad." Second, an hour later, was longer, more frantic, something about how this had all gotten out of control, and she never meant for things to go this far. I read both messages and set the phone face down on the nightstand. It wasn't that I didn't feel anything reading them. I did. But feeling something and being ready to respond to it are 2 very different things, and I wasn't ready yet. Ryan told me later, much later, once enough time had passed, that we could actually speak like 2 adults. Instead of 2 people standing on opposite sides of a fracture, that he'd called his mother again that night, hoping she might soften, might tell him this had all been some kind of misunderstanding that could still be walked back. Helen didn't soften. I warned you for years, she told him, according to what he eventually admitted to me. I told you over and over that, if you kept letting Madison treat Ashley like an intruder in her own home, you'd lose something you couldn't get back. You just never believed it would actually happen. He sat with that, he said, longer than he wanted to admit. And somewhere in that silence, things he'd spent years not really looking at started surfacing, whether he wanted them to or not. He thought about the roof. He'd noticed the new shingles on his mother's house 2 winters ago, vaguely registered them, and never once asked who'd paid for the repair or arranged the contractor. It had been me quietly, the way I'd done most things for that family. Not for credit, just because it needed doing, and nobody else was doing it. He thought about the cardiology appointments. Helen had a scare with her heart 3 years back, a series of follow-ups and monitoring visits that stretched across several months. And it had been me driving her every single time, sitting with her in waiting rooms, holding her hand through an echocardiogram, while Ryan sent apologetic texts about being slammed at work. He hadn't attended a single one of those appointments, not one. He thought about the surgery the year before that, a hip replacement that kept Helen off her feet for 6 weeks, and how it had been me who moved into her guest room for the first 2 weeks of recovery, managing her medications, cooking her meals, helping her to the bathroom in the middle of the night, when she was too proud to ask her son for that kind of help. Ryan had visited twice that whole stretch, each time for less than an hour. He thought finally about all the bills, the property taxes he'd assumed his mother handled herself, the insurance renewals, small repairs here and there that seemed to sort themselves out without him ever having to think about them. He'd never once wondered how exactly those things kept getting handled. He'd just been grateful they weren't his problem, without asking whose problem they'd actually become. When he called his mother back near midnight, he told me his voice had cracked in a way it hadn't since he was a kid. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me find out like this in front of everyone?" Helen's answer was quiet, but unflinching. And it was the part of that night Ryan repeated to me more than once in the weeks that followed, like he needed to hear himself say it out loud to actually believe it had happened. "Ashley never asked for this house. She said she never asked for anything in 9 years. Not once. I gave it to her because she earned my trust in 100 small ways you never noticed. Because you were too busy managing your daughter's feelings to notice your wife's absence of complaints. I didn't do this to punish you, Ryan. I did it because it was the only thing I had that was truly mine to give. And I wanted it to go to the person who actually deserved it." He didn't have an answer for that. He told me later there wasn't one. That for the first time in longer than he could remember, he understood exactly how much he'd allowed himself not to see, and exactly how much it had cost the one person who'd never once demanded to be seen. Ryan and Madison moved out within 3 weeks faster than the 30 days Harper had given them, which I think was its own kind of statement. There was no lawsuit, no drawn-out fight over the deed, no attempt to contest what Helen had done. I think in the end, Ryan understood there was nothing left to contest. The paperwork was clean, the timeline was clear, and somewhere underneath his shock, I believe he also understood it was fair, even if fair was the last thing he wanted it to be. I moved into the house on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in July, with my sister helping me carry boxes up the same porch steps, where all of it had unraveled a month before. It felt strange at first, walking through rooms I'd visited so many times as a guest, and now belonged to me in every legal sense. I spent that first weekend doing something I hadn't done in years, working in the garden Helen had let go untended during her recovery, pulling weeds from beds that used to be beautiful, planting new bulbs along the back fence where I remembered she'd once grown dahlia. I found a box of old family photographs in a hallway closet. Faded pictures of Helen as a young woman, of Ryan as a boy, of relatives I recognized and some I didn't. I had them reframed and hung them back along the staircase where they belonged, because whatever had happened between Ryan and me, this house held Helen's whole life, and I wasn't going to let that get lost in the wreckage of everything else. 3. A month after I moved in, Helen asked if she could host another barbecue. I said yes before she even finished the question. It felt important somehow to let that tradition continue, rather than let one terrible afternoon define the space for good. It was different this time, smaller, quieter, no shouting across the yard, no ultimatums, no one waiting to see whose side everyone else would take. Helen's sister brought her potato salad. One of the cousins manned the grill without complaint, and I spent most of the afternoon sitting beside Helen on the porch swing, watching the yard fill with people who actually wanted to be there. Ryan reached out eventually, a handwritten letter that arrived in the mail rather than a text or a call, which surprised me. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope before I even opened it. Inside, he wrote about the years he'd spent managing Madison's feelings, instead of protecting our marriage, about the excuses he'd made without ever noticing how many there had been, about the version of himself he was trying to become, now that he'd finally stopped looking away. He didn't ask for the house back. He didn't ask for anything, really. I think by then he understood there wasn't anything left to ask for. I read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light. Then I folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. I didn't tear it up because there was no anger left in me by that point, just a quiet, settled kind of peace. But I didn't write back either because some doors closed, not out of bitterness, but simply because you finally found what was on the other side of them, and it turns out to be enough. I think about that barbecue often now, the one where everything fell apart in front of an entire family. For a long time afterward, I believed I'd walked out of that yard and lost something. A husband, a family, 9 years of trying. But sitting on this porch now, surrounded by a garden I planted with my own hands, in a house filled with people who actually see me, I understand it differently. I didn't lose a family that day. I finally stopped mistaking tolerance for belonging, and I walked toward the family that had been quietly choosing me back the entire time. In 100 small ways I'd almost stopped noticing. The morning of that barbecue, I thought leaving that yard was the worst moment of my life. Now I know it was the moment I finally started living one that was actually mine. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear where you'd have drawn your own line. Have you ever had a moment where you finally stopped accepting less than you deserved from the people who were supposed to love you? Tell me in the comments below, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. We share stories like Ashley's every single day here. Real heartfelt journeys about family loyalty and the quiet strength it takes to finally choose yourself. So, if this one stayed with you, subscribe and stay close, because there's always another story waiting and I don't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for walking through this one with me. Let's keep going.